Welcome back to Next Wave Conversations presented by the Innovate GPT Group. I'm your host, Chris Lukianenko, and today we're diving into the dynamic world of higher education and AI innovation with a distinguished guest, Michael Burgess. Distinguished, how's that? That's pretty good.
That's impressive.
Michael is a strategic advisor and consultant at Future Now Consulting and has a wealth of experience in transforming higher education, with roles spanning from Chief Student Experience Officer at Western Sydney University to marketing leadership at Weight Watchers and NRMA. Michael has seen it all, and he's also an advocate for innovation, which is the right place to be for us right today. This is great. So in this episode, we're going to explore how generative AI is reshaping the landscape of higher education, from enhancing student learning to streamlining administrative processes. We'll also tackle the tough topic of overcoming resistance to change in institutions and hear Michael's strategies for fostering a culture of innovation. So whether you're an educational leader, a tech enthusiast, or someone interested in the future of learning, this episode is going to be packed with insights that you're not going to want to miss. So why don't we just get started? Welcome aboard, mate.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much for having us. He turns off his phone as we get started. Well done. Well done. Now, look, mate, we're going to talk about transformation today because that is one of your areas of expertise, and specifically we want to touch on higher education. And if listeners can recall my recent chat with Ray Fleming, they would know that, he is waiting for bated breath for transformational change in this space, where they're still practicing the art of the old lecture, which was innovated in 1088 or whatever it was. So, Michael, that's a long time ago. There hasn't been any transformational change of note really in that time period. Are we kidding ourselves? Can we really see change in higher ed on the horizon?
Not only can we, but we must, I think is the answer.
Yes.
Ray and I are kindred spirits when it comes to this, and we've sort of interacted for a number of years ever since I've been in the sector, and, we're very much aligned in this. And I think it's interesting. I joined the sector about 8.5 years ago. Yep. Prior to that, I was in the commercial sector for all of my career. And the thing that drew me to higher education was in my previous role at Weight Watchers, I was fortunate enough to be asked onto a global innovation team looking at how we could disrupt our own business. World leader in weight loss for over 50 years, and they finally saw that the writing was on the wall. So spent a lot of time in New York. We had the best of the best, Insight, which is Clay Christensen's business, you name it, all helping us to look at how we could reinvent or disrupt ourselves. Ironically, the business didn't. And it's
just going to say, I was thinking to myself, didn't that?
Yeah. So now it's literally it's just joined the pile of organisations that were world leaders no longer exist.
Yep.
So that was a profound learning for me of being up close and personal to disruption.
Yep.
And one of the things I found through that process was we were looking at sectors and looking at disruption by sector, and there was one that stood out as not having been disrupted. And yet the settings were as ripe as any, and that was education.
Yeah.
There's too much money. Most of the incumbents are lazy, or that they haven't changed at all. And the growth is just too strong. Now, you combine all of those factors, and that's only going to lead to one thing. And then, of course, you add to that the externalities, so the need for change. Mm-hmm. And this was all pre-Gen AI. So you look at it now, there's absolutely no way the world can or will wait for education to catch up. So it will change.
Universities don't become the next Blockbuster.
Basically. No, they certainly don't. They certainly don't. And, and I'll give you one little example of that, which I think is just so illustrative of the challenge. I used to spend quite a bit of time in the Pacific Northwest in the US with the tech companies.
Good beer up that way.
Good beer. Good beer, I wouldn't know. And they'd all talk about tell the same story, and that is their requirement for skills to be able to drive their organisations. What they required today would take 10 years within a 500-mile radius to deliver through traditional channels, through education. And I remember coming back and saying to the team, you watch this space because industry doesn't wait for another sector to catch up. And of course, what happened then? Google came out with their career certificates. Mm-hmm. I think there's now 6 or 7 of them now. It costs you about $600 US. You can finish these in 6 to 9 months. There's over 8 million people have completed these, and 72% of them say that it has led to an improvement in their employment status, either a promotion, a pay rise, or whatever. So I think that's just a really good example of innovation, this time being driven by the commercial sector, because they need it.
myself, I've got a uni degree. My son is currently studying psychology.
Yep.
And I'm more than a little bit skeptical about, and I've actually worked in a university for a while too, and I'm more than a little skeptical about, that general desire for universities to embrace change. What are some of the common barriers that you're seeing when it comes to higher education institutions actually wanting to embrace change?
The first one I'd say is culture, and I mean I put culture at the top of the list with any organisation, any sector.
Yep.
When I first joined Western, and Western, I've got to say, is a great university, one of the more progressive, more centralised. So, and my role was quite a unique role. It was a new role to the sector, so I had a lot of latitude.
Yep.
One thing that became apparent to me very early on, though, was that it was a very unique culture and a culture that was really working against innovation.
Yep.
There's, and I could spend hours, we don't have hours, but, sort of picking that apart. But firstly, if you look at academics are defined by, their self is defined by what they do.
Yes.
So therefore, showing vulnerability, showing you don't know something is potentially seen to be a weakness.
Yes. Yep.
Now, me, for my sins, have always been one to just kind of lead with the chin and put my hand up. And so I'd go into these executive meetings and say, hey, I don't understand something, or here's my view on something. And quite often you get these looks of astonishment. And then you'd walk out of the room and find out that everyone else agreed with you. A lot of people did, but they wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
Now, that is not a healthy environment. No. If you want to change an organisation.
No, absolutely.
So, and then if I think about my first 5 odd years at Western, prosecuting the case for change, talking the disruption story, knowing a lot about it, and I'd go and, try and take people on this journey, and the amount of resistance you'd meet, ranging from, you don't know what you're talking about, it won't happen to us. One very senior person who was in a strategy role said to me, I've been hearing about disruption for 40 years. Now, that's not particularly helpful.
No.
So I think that, it's interesting now. It's been accelerated by COVID, but it was happening anyway. Now the sector absolutely understands the need for change. Now the problem is, what do you do about it?
Yeah, just that understanding, but the willingness side is the thing that I get worried about, because it's not like these are like a 10-year-old tech company or a startup that, they can very quickly pivot and change and embrace new ideas. Not only are you talking about cultural change, but you've just got hundreds, probably thousands of years of history that you're up against as well, and all the traditions that go along with that. Like that adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah. If you were to start up a university today, it would look nothing like the universities we have. And that's not being critical. And
that's okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not being critical at all of universities, because they do a fabulous job. They're amazing institutions. But, we need to call out the reality of the situation we face.
Yep.
And this is one of them. They're overly complex. They're way too inefficient and expensive.
Yep.
And innovating within any organisation is really hard. The average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company has declined from 75 years back in the 50s to 15 years today.
Wow.
And we all know the examples of all of those great companies that are now on the trash heap.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not just the education sector where this is a challenge, but I think it's more of a challenge in the education sector, because if commercial organisations, which are typically a lot more nimble and customer focused and everything else, can't get around this and can't transform themselves, it's increasing, obviously it's a lot harder for universities.
Yeah. In the unis, in my experience in working with them, the lecturers carried a lot of power.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of respect. Like I was not a member of the faculty. I had to refer to these people as doctor. I couldn't even use their first name. Like I couldn't say "G'day, Chris" or anything like that. It was like I think they carried more power and weight than maybe they should have compared to maybe the CEO or the vice chancellor or whoever it might be. How do you start to navigate those cultural things coming in and wanting to? Like, are you going through to the vice chancellor first, or do you need to get groundswell with the lecturers perhaps first, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. They're very unusual, these organisations, from that respect. So in a lot of respects, academics and lecturers are almost like independent contractors. They see themselves working for themselves, not for the organisation. I had a similar dynamic at play when I worked at the NRMA a long time ago, 20 years ago, where a lot of the staff who are highly unionised saw themselves working for themselves or for their members, almost against the organisation. Now, I'm not saying lecturers are that extreme, but But it's an interesting dynamic. So how do you tackle it? I think you tackle it in a number of ways. Firstly, provide evidence. And ironically, for an evidence-based learning institution, when I arrived at Western, this is true of most universities, if not all at the time, the evidence base was non-existent. So very little understanding about the customer experience or the student experience. Very little understanding about those basic things like what I'd call buyer behaviour, or in this case, preferencing behaviour. So simple questions. How does a student decide which university they're going to go to? What are the things that influence them? We had no idea.
And I think maybe the lecturers don't want to understand. I'm here to deliver my lecture. I'm an expert in my field. I'm an academic. Respect me, listen to me, whatever. I don't need to worry about getting international students through the door or anything like that sort of thing, do they?
Well, and they don't. That's the reality.
Yeah.
But what you need to do is make sure you've got the right people who are very clear on what they need to do, and then ensure you're creating the culture where everybody's aligned. And everyone knows the role that they're playing, and they're all rowing in the same direction. I think one of the other interesting dynamics at play here, which once again was similar at the NRMA when I first joined, if you don't have a common enemy, then you start to get a lot of internal focus and internalisation. And there hasn't really been a common enemy. Everyone will talk about, competition and rankings and so on, but the reality is everyone's been in a good paddock in this sector for a long period of time.
Is the common enemy, you mentioned Google before, is it third-party education providers that are more willing to shake this thing up and change? Could that be their common enemy moving forward, or is there still that element that I must get a university degree?
I think the common enemy is not a common enemy. I think it's become a lot more complex than that. I think that there is a lot of substitutional pathways you can take now. You see all the data on this. Perceived value of education, higher education, is in decline significantly if you look at places like the US and the UK. And it's happening here. If students can go and work for an organisation from the get-go and get skilled up within that organisation for a good brand, that becomes a pretty good option, rather than going and spending 4 or 5 years studying somewhere with unknown employment opportunities.
That's a really good point. I remember a friend who used to work for one of the big consulting groups before he came and joined the company that I was at. He'd never worked outside of that consulting group, but had done virtually a full MBA through there, and didn't have a certificate from one of the big universities or anything like that, but was very highly regarded because they had to have that internal training all the way through. So, maybe what you're saying there is that you don't need to jump out into these higher education.
So back to the Google career certificate example for a second. They now have close on 300 US tech firms who are all hiring off the basis of people having completed those certificates, and a lot of them consider that to be the equivalent of a 4-year degree. So that shows...
Only 9 months on a one subject.
It's competency-based, so it could take a period of time.
Okay, sure.
But I think that's just a really interesting illustration of where this old kind of rigid, time-based education model is clearly outmoded, outdated. It should be competency-based. And, of course, we're now moving – everyone talks about, micro-skilling and, moving into this new world of micro-credentialing and so on. Really what that means is the world is changing so rapidly and the skills required are changing so quickly that having some sort of a set program that you go and do for a long period of time, and it's probably taken an awfully long period of time to be developed in the first place, is just not fit for purpose. I mean, and this is one of the areas where universities clearly need to change, because if you look at the development time for the development of degrees, for example, we're talking years. Now, I don't need to tell you what's happening in the world around generative AI and so on. We're talking weeks, if not days.
Exactly.
It's a different world.
So you operate a consulting group. You're not just working with one customer. What are some of the other customers that you're working with seeing in this space, and how are they tackling what I'm going to call is an opportunity to maybe seize upon and become the Netflix for the university's blockbuster, perhaps?
Yeah, so I'm when you say a consulting group, I'm working for a consulting group of me.
That's okay.
Which I made the decision after 7.5 years of a really fulfilling time at Western that I could apply myself better, or I could add a lot of value going back into the sector and advise, and given my experience and given my skill set around strategy. So working across a number of institutions, but also other organisations like tech companies who are not only keen to get into the higher ed space for obvious reasons, but are required, I believe. So, gone are the days where universities could do everything themselves. And I think that what's really necessary is we need to have that mix of skills, mix of kind of worldviews, and we need those capabilities that universities don't have. Universities have great capabilities, but they don't have all the capabilities, just like any other organisation does. So, that's clearly part of the solution here is technology, but it's got to change the way it's done. So as Scott Pulsifer, who's the president of Western Governors University in the US, really interesting guy, came from Amazon Web Services. And he ran their web store. And he's sort of a new breed of university leader. He started up a whole new type of university. He talks about the three challenges that universities have. First one is they are attracted to shiny things, which I totally concur with, and that is universities historically have, as have a lot of organisations, been attracted to the next shiny bit of technology. So what happens is they go, well, we're going to go and buy that really expensive bit of enterprise, whatever it is, platform, and implement it. The problem is you spend eye-watering amounts of money. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't shift the dial. Why doesn't it? Because you're not informed by strategy, which it should be, because technology should be basically an enabler to deliver something, right? So that's the first issue. The second one is they're highly complex, compromised models, incredibly complex. Too complex. They shouldn't be so complex. We're not talking Boeing or NASA. So that makes innovation a challenge as well. And then the third thing is they are trying to cater for current customers in a current market rather than the market that ought to be, which is a term that Scott Pulsifer uses, which I really like, which is what we've got to be starting to think about now, right? So, the world's changing so rapidly, we shouldn't be thinking about what universities were traditionally providing or what they're providing today, because that's irrelevant. What they need to be providing in the future is going to be very, very different. It needs to be very different.
Yeah, I know. We talk about Ray Fleming. He talks about the Netflix of education potentially being the next model. I want to learn what I want to learn and only what I need to learn, and deliver it to me the way I want it and when I want it.
Absolutely spot on.
Who's going to be the first to crack that, do you reckon?
I think it already has been cracked to some extent.
That Google thing Google's
a good example.
A good example, yeah.
So I used to have really interesting debates around this stuff, and it's good to get into debate. So one of the things I would do is I would provoke by talking about customers, and that used to get people bristle, right? Because we're not customers. and the reason why I do it is not because I wanted to be provocative for the sake of it, but because it's important for us to be able to engage in these honest conversations. And so you go on and say, well, what's the matter with a customer? Tell me from your own personal experience what the best experience you have in your life is in terms of a brand. And on nearly every occasion, it's with some commercial brand, right? In that context, you're a customer. One of the biggest purchases anyone will ever make is education. Now, if we thought more about students as customers and their particular needs, and if we became as laser focused on our customers or our students as commercial organisations are about their customers, that could only be of benefit to students and to the sector as a whole. So I think that, striking up that sort of conversation and having that sort of debate, if it's done, framed correctly and constructively, can only be a good thing. But it's also an example of why we need to be bringing in people outside of the sector as well. We need that mix.
What's your thoughts on generative AI? Can it be part of this change? Can it lead the change, or are they too early for it? Or
absolutely. I mean, yes, and yes. It's not too early. Sorry, yes and yes. But we've got to be careful we don't make the same mistake as we've made with all these other technologies, and that is we need the technology
rather than solving
what is it we're trying to do. Let's diagnose the issue. Let's understand what the market ought to be for the future, and then let's look at how generative AI can enable that. So there's an ordering required here. But we need generative AI for a couple of reasons. Obviously, to help make the organisations more efficient, more flexible, better able to deliver support. Take away a lot of the huge burden that academics currently have. And it's increasing as, there's more and more compliance measures piled on top of them. That's only increasing. But then, of course, from the other side of it, and I don't think there's enough discussion around this, and that is, firstly, everybody going through university today is going to be using generative AI in increasing ways in the future.
Yep.
What are we doing to skill them up to be able to make the most of that?
Yep.
First point.
Yep.
Secondly, and this is not my area of expertise whatsoever, but from a sort of pedagogical perspective, a learning perspective, what is learning? Now that raises all sorts of questions. What should we be teaching kids or people in general?
Yeah.
Certainly, we certainly need to look at that very carefully, and I suspect it's going to be very different to what we've been teaching in the past.
And that's what you're saying before about teaching getting yourself sorted out for the future. So the kids that are coming through now that are born with an iPad in their hand, they're not going to want to sit in a lecture theatre and listen to an old guy read from a book. That's a massive change, and that's probably only 15 or so years away. And some of these things that we're talking about, these needs to change, the transformation that's got to occur, it's not going to happen overnight.
It's happening now. So, and once again, it was accelerated by COVID, but we moved to this sort of flipped learning model or hybrid learning.
Yep.
So you've got students learning remotely from in the lecture hall as well to some extent.
Yep.
Although, the dirty truth is that students actually don't turn up to lectures that often anyway, unless they're mandated to.
I know I didn't.
Yeah. But there's all sorts of implications around that. And I remember at the time when post-COVID and we've gone through this and everyone's kind of going, great, we've transitioned online and that's all great, which it was. But where's the deep thinking in terms of the implications of this?
Yep.
So firstly around what does that do for the value perception of education? I suspect it goes through the floor.
Yep. What am I paying for if I'm just sitting at home on a Zoom call?
Exactly right. If you look at what the sort of what the successful ingredients are that enables you to successfully complete your education. Obviously, it's learning and teaching. Now, I know Ray talked about this. There's a huge opportunity for us to look at how we can, at scale, provide tutoring or learning support.
Yep.
That's a huge opportunity. But there's all these other dimensions, such as a sense of belongingness. That's a critical success factor for most students when it comes to their university education. Now, if they're sitting in a room somewhere remotely, then that's a huge challenge.
Yep.
So how do we overcome that? Now, technology can help us in huge ways there. There's also, I could talk to you for hours about this, but there's a whole challenge around getting students to hold their attention for more than 5 seconds now. And there's been plenty of research onto this, right? So to your point, we've got this generation coming through who have been brought up on tablets and phones and all the rest of it, their attention spans.
Yeah. And what about the thing, which is one of the core things that I loved about going to university, was the building of relationships, being in the same place at the same time, university bar on a Wednesday night, or in the common rooms in the lunch spots. That, since COVID, yes, we've pushed them all onto these online learnings and they're doing all that sort of thing, but I know, especially with my son, he has none of that face-to-face, that human contact, which makes me sad because, I think of down in Tasmania, half the business relationships that are occurring today are because they met at university.
Spot on.
And that seems to have disappeared a bit. What do we do about that?
Spot on. It's a huge challenge, and it's happening for a number of reasons. So, yes, there's remote learning. Secondly, university or going to university is a lot more transactional than it used to be. Yep. Now, because I'm old, I can remember back to when I was at uni back in Melbourne, and we were the last cohort to get free education.
Oh, I'm not quite that old.
No, thanks.
I paid for mine.
But back then it was kind of like you bet, right? You just had at university. One of my mates was there for, I think, 10 years. He had a great time. But now, of course, you've got all of these other strains and stresses. And if I think about the profile of students at Western Sydney, a lot of them live out in the West. They have to work to survive. So it's a very transactional kind of an experience. So they don't have time, the luxury of forming relationships. Universities quite often are multi-campus now. So Western's got 12, 13 campuses.
Yep.
That's a challenge. You don't get that scale benefit.
Yeah.
So it's a big challenge. And then, of course, at a broader societal level, that's a challenge anyway. You talk to people who are trying to get into relationships now. I mean, it's really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But once again, technology can help with this.
Yep.
In my time at Western, and a lot of the work I do now is very much focused on that component of it. And we don't want to underestimate how important it is.
You mentioned that you're old. I didn't say that, but you mentioned. Do you think you've got enough time? We'll wrap this conversation up here with this. Do you think you've got enough time left in the rest of your working career to actually see transformational change in this space?
Absolutely. There is no doubt. Firstly, I'm not that old. there is no doubt transformational change is going to happen, because if you look at the demand side, industry, employers, students are going to demand it, right?
Yep.
So it's going to happen. The question is, where's it going to come from?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we equate education to being 42 universities, then I think we've missed the point. So I think that you will see innovation occurring within the university sector, but if you look at the broader higher educational sector, I think a lot of that transformation is going to be coming from, as I said, these commercial organisations who are innovating. And
maybe those 42 universities are going to be forced to get on the bus or become Blockbuster.
Yeah. And you know, it's not... I used to have this discussion with people, and quite often the response you would get would be binary. Either it happens or it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the point.
Yep.
It's absolutely going to happen. The question is, to what extent does it start to eat at the margins?
Yep. Because
one of the challenges for universities is they're largely a fixed cost model, and therefore they don't have the flex that most commercial organisations have to weather, you know, ups and downs in market conditions and so on. So it's the degree to which they start being picked off at the edges, and that other offerings start to come into play.
Maybe we pick this conversation up in a year's time and see whether it's happened. Mate, thank you very much for joining me today. I've really loved this chat. Really loved your insights, and thanks for being part of the podcast.
Thank you.
Podcast.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.